Buenas tardes, vamos a empezar con la siguiente sección. Me gustaría invitar a todas las personas de tomar asiento. Okay, good afternoon. I'll be speaking in English this time. And in the next session, I'll be speaking in Dutch. So I'll be just going through all the languages that we normally use. So our next presenter is Christine Runnegar. She is a director of the public policy at Internet Society. And she will be highlighting the balance of privacy and security, the risk of pervasive surveillance. As you may know, we have had a lot of discussions, or we have heard a lot of discussions going on with respect to security going on in the world. And Brazil was one of the countries, given that basically what your president, Dilma Rousseff, said, we have seen some developments going on. So I think it's quite important for us to be focusing on this topic. So without further ado, I would like to give Christine Runnegar the opportunity to give this presentation. Christine.
Good afternoon, everyone. For the interpreters, thank you. And I'll also be speaking in English. Everyone, I thought I had an hour for this session, but I've been told to speed things up a little, so I may leave out some of the examples that I was planning to share with you so that we can have a little bit of time to discuss this important topic. So let's get started, and the first test will be whether I can get the technology to work. As the title suggests, the focus of our discussion today is going to be the risks of pervasive surveillance in pursuit of greater national security. However, let me remind you that surveillance is not just the realm of governments. As we know, for example, some commercial entities benefit from monitoring our online interactions. Indeed, there are new industries that have emerged and prospered from the exploitation of personal data made visible on the internet, such as data broking or also targeted advertising. Now, some people argue that these so-called free services that we come to expect, so maps, search engines, social media, would not and perhaps could not be provided without large-scale collection and secondary use of personal data, or that otherwise those services would be vastly inferior. But it's important to ask ourselves, is this a fair bargain for the user, and is it a fair bargain from the perspective of a society? We should also keep in mind that our personal data has also trained the extractors, the search engines, the search algorithms, and the tools that correlate and analyse, recognise patterns and relationships and make predictions, making them ever more powerful. Have you ever wondered how your search engine is able to decipher your misspelling? Why the translation program you use is becoming more proficient? How your email service distinguishes social from promotional email, how your photo sharing service is able to recognise that images of faces are of the same individual, or how your voice command service is able to distinguish two similar sounding words, or how is your map service able to predict your likely location. In other words, how is your service provider able to personalise your experience, anticipating your needs and wants? This trend towards personalisation may create better services and a better user experience, but it also provides a series of honeypots for secondary surveillance, such as in the context of national security and intelligence agencies. Okay, so let's get to pervasive surveillance. When we talk about pervasive surveillance, what do we mean? We're talking about monitoring and interception by commercial, governmental and other entities of internet communications, data and or metadata. We're also talking about weakened encryption standards, circumvention of encryption technologies and other exploits that are designed to break open the protections used by internet users to keep their communications private. We're also talking talking about the contamination of security-related standards, products and services in the course of reaching the market. And basically it seems like every day a new method is revealed. The key aspect that qualitatively differentiates pervasive surveillance from monitoring, for example, like traditional eavesdropping, is that long-term, untargeted or indiscriminate data collection up to all communication flows available at a particular point allows correlation of data over long periods of time. And time is very important here, because collection and storage of large data sets mean that analysis can be performed at a later time and maybe with stronger capabilities should the motivation arise. And notably the potential scale and reach of the threat is magnitudes greater than the more traditional threats that we are familiar with. So what is the objective? The objective is to gather as much data as possible and to apply selective analysis after the fact. This means that all or nearly all internet communications are targets for these attacks. And to achieve this scale, the attacks are physically pervasive, they affect a large number of internet communications, they are pervasive in content, consuming and exploiting any information revealed by a protocol, and they are pervasive in technology, exploiting many different vulnerabilities in many different protocols. It's also worth noting that merely because internet communications and data are not encrypted or otherwise protected or obscured does not mean that the sender or the intended recipient considers that data to be public. Furthermore, even where the communications and data are publicly accessible, individuals might quite reasonably expect that such data would not be used by others in a different context or for a different purpose, such as surveillance. And data that has been collected may be stored for indefinite periods of time and over time linked with more and more data sets. And data that is considered meaningless noise today could one day be rendered meaningful through developments in data analytics. Content that is currently safe from decryption may not remain protected forever. Future decryption techniques may be successful in rendering the text in clear text. And further, it's also important to remember that there's a whole field of behavioural and heuristic traffic analysis that has emerged to reveal or guess what encrypted traffic might be. What's more, data collected today can already tell us more than who we are, what we have done, what we are doing, but also what we are going to do. And it's becoming increasingly possible to extrapolate future behaviour. Another thing that you need to keep in mind is that surveillance tools and techniques, which today may only be available to a select group of states or entities, could rapidly become resources that anyone could access and use. So that takes me to the risks of pervasive surveillance. I've already mentioned a few. There are really two aspects to the risk profile of pervasive surveillance that's undertaken by or on behalf of national security or intelligence agencies. The inherent risks of pervasive surveillance itself, I've highlighted some of these already, and the risks that have emerged as a consequence of the public unveiling of these activities, and these aspects are interrelated. The risk that is at the front and centre of the public debate on pervasive surveillance is widespread violation of privacy rights and expectations, and the prospect of a panopticon society where our lives are under constant observation and judgment. In this process, though, some important principles about privacy have been highlighted. I'm going to mention two. The first is that data collection in of itself is an interference of privacy. If you look at the report that was put out by the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights earlier this year, in that report it says even the mere possibility of communications information being captured creates an interference with privacy, with a potential chilling effect on rights, including those of freedom of expression and association. The second principle I'd like to highlight is that metadata can have a privacy impact as well. And we can discuss these issues a little later, But first, let's consider what are some of the other risks. So another risk is discrimination. And even before the Snowden disclosures, Europe had started considering an expanded definition of personal data, which is the gatekeeper criterion for data protection, to a definition that reads something like this: an identified natural person or natural person who can be identified directly or indirectly, and here's the important point, or singled out and treated differently. And this is a recognition of the potential threat for discrimination. We also see that decisions by governments like the US to continue to collect non-public internet user data may encourage other countries to do the same, so-called copycats. And unchecked, this could lead to the scenario I mentioned earlier of the monitored internet, where users have no choice but to protect their communications by technology, such as strong encryption or Tor, and social strategies like seeding false information, creating multiple personae, and self-censoring becomes the common practice. We may also lose diversity of thought and expression. Surveillance may lead to a society of conformity and, as I mentioned earlier, self-censorship. We already see indications that behaviour online is changing. For example, in a study that was undertaken of citizens in the US, Canada, China, Mexico, Japan, Germany, South Korea, United Kingdom, France, Saudi Arabia, and importantly, Brazil. It was a study undertaken by Alex Matthews and Catherine Tuckery, using 282 search terms from 3 different sources. So one was a Department of Homeland Security list of search terms that it tracks on social media sites. Second one was the Google's top 50 search terms for 2013. And the third category was a crowdsourced exercise to identify potentially embarrassing search terms that did not implicate Homeland Security. And so what did they find using these 3 sets of search terms? They found that US-based search traffic falls by around 5% in the Google Trends Index for government-sensitive terms after the PRISM revelations. But they also found that Google users in the other countries, on average, search less, not only for government-sensitive search terms, such as anthrax, but also on personally sensitive terms, like eating disorder. What we may also see is citizens may grow to distrust their own governments. There are some more risks. What we might also see is the demand for surveillance fuels an industry in surveillance technologies and techniques. We may also see not only citizens' loss of distrust, increasing distrust of citizens and governments, but also a loss of trust in governments that have traditionally been strong advocates of the internet governance model, and also calls to change the management of the internet. We might also see reduced confidence in existing terms of transborder privacy and data protection frameworks, and we've already seen this playing out between the US and Europe regarding the EU-US Safe Harbour Agreement. There could also be a negative impact on cloud services or technology companies that are based in known surveillance countries. And there are some studies that have been released by the Information Technology Innovation Foundation, Forrester Research, and the Independent, showing significant drops in revenue for technology companies in the order of billions. In the interest of time, I won't go through that here. So the next thing we want to look at is some strategies that have emerged to mitigate or to deal with extraterritorial surveillance, with a view, this is my view, that we should have a robust discussion later on the pros and cons of these strategies. And I'm going to call them policy ripples. Almost every institution, organisation and community involved in internet policy development has reacted in one way or another to the surveillance disclosures. And as a rough guide, those reactions tend to fall into one of these 6 categories. So the first is statements of principles, and then we have data localization policies, traffic routing policies, legal action, assertion of jurisdiction and diplomatic pressure. Just doing a quick time check. I think I've probably got time to go through them quickly, but we might drop some of the examples. So if we look at the first, statements of principles, I'm sure you're all very familiar with the UN General Assembly's resolution last year on the right to privacy in the digital age. There is a second resolution that was passed by the third committee just this week. One that is also might be of interest is the Joint Declaration on Surveillance Programs and Their Impact on Freedom of Expression, which was a joint statement of the Special Rapporteur on the protection of and promotion of the right to freedom of opinion and expression, and the Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. And there are numerous other examples. We also see the emergence of mandatory data localization policies, and these are policies that require data to be stored or processed locally, so within the jurisdiction, and or what I'm going to call traffic routing policies. And these are policies that seek to prescribe how internet traffic should or should not be routed. And they may specify within the jurisdiction routing and or restrict routing outside the jurisdiction, or they might require all traffic to be routed through a specific data center or network. In fact, here in Brazil, an earlier version of the Civil Internet Bill contained a provision that would have forced operators of online services to store Brazilian data only in Brazilian data centres. I understand this proposal was ultimately dropped before the bill was passed. And there are other examples from India and Russia and Germany and Europe, but in the interest of time, we won't cover them here. However, when we get to the discussion, I'd be very interested in your views on the potential implications of these strategies for the internet, for internet users, privacy, user choice, freedom of expression, the availability of online services, etc., and even in terms of practicality. So start thinking now. But in the meantime, let me just cover the other remaining issues. I should also mention that in some parts of the world, countries that were already considering increasing their capacity to exchange regional traffic via the establishment of IXPs and other means of interconnection, they've hastened their work in this area in light of the revelations. And for example, there's a proposal for an undersea cable from Brazil to Portugal, which would bypass the US. Then, of course, I mentioned legal action. You've probably heard about the case in the European Court of Human Rights dealing with the legality of mass surveillance by the UK GCHQ. This case has been put on the fast track. It's been given the rare priority designation, which is very significant. It's also important to mention here that the European Court of Justice recently ruled that the EU Data Protection Directive was invalid. Then I also mentioned there was this assertion of jurisdiction. You see this a lot in Europe. You see calls for and statements that European law applies if the data of European citizens is involved, or if companies are doing business in Europe. And then there are numerous examples of diplomatic pressure. Some of the well-known ones are the European Parliament calling for the suspension of the SWIFT agreement and the suspension of the EU-US Safe Harbour Agreement, and so on. Okay, so that's the end of the risks. I'm sure there are plenty more that you can identify for me, and that's also the end of my overview of what are some of the emerging strategies to deal with the emergence of pervasive surveillance. If I have a couple of minutes, I just thought it would be useful to talk about some initiatives from the internet technical community, and I'll try and keep this quite brief. So you've heard a lot already today about the IETF. The IETF and the World Wide Web Consortium, which is the W3C, they've implemented initiatives to specifically address privacy and security in internet standards development, and they did this well before the Snowden revelations. One example from the IETF is the RFC 6973, which is privacy considerations for internet protocols, and the W3C is developing similar guidance for web standards through the Privacy Interest Group. In particular, regarding the pervasive surveillance threat, which in the IETF world is described as pervasive monitoring, the IETF and the W3C have responded with a number of initiatives, and here are some examples. First of all, there's a new public email list, PerPass, which anyone can join, and this is to discuss specific technical proposals for improvements in IETF protocols for better mitigation against pervasive monitoring. And as was emphasised earlier, the mailing lists and public meetings are open to everyone. Very significantly, the IETF reached consensus at IETF 88 to address pervasive surveillance as a community in all its standards track specifications. Earlier this year, the W3C and the Internet Architecture Board held a joint workshop on strengthening the Internet against pervasive monitoring called STRINT. There is now a best current practice RFC 7258, pervasive monitoring is attack. And the work is ongoing. Very recently, the Internet Architecture Board released a statement on Internet confidentiality, urging protocol designers to design for confidential operation by default, encouraging developers to include encryption in their implementations and to make them encrypted by default, encouraging network and service operators to deploy encryption where it is not yet deployed, and urging firewall policy administrators to permit encrypted traffic. The IB Privacy and Security Program is working on three aspects which are also relevant to pervasive surveillance. They are confidentiality, trust, and internet scale resilience. And in the confidentiality area, we're working on a document called Confidentiality in the Face of Pervasive Surveillance, a Threat Model and Problem Statement. Okay. So, to conclude, let me leave you with some thoughts. Legal concepts such as necessary, proportionate and reasonable were meant to ensure that the appropriate balance was struck between legitimate national security interests on the one hand and privacy and other individual rights on the other hand. However, from what we have seen, this model has proved to be vulnerable to misuse. And I would argue that here the key criterion is legitimacy. To be legitimate, the surveillance policy must not only be legal, but it must be demonstrably necessary, proportionate and fair. And since fairness is a subjective quality, demonstrating fairness relies on other factors such as accountability, transparency and appropriate representation of the rights of all stakeholders. And technical and legal protection against pervasive surveillance comes with a cost and often involves making trade-offs, which in turn can influence the deployability of the solution and its effectiveness. And since pervasive surveillance threat is global in nature, these trade-offs may potentially affect the whole internet ecosystem. And difficult decisions will need to be made in each case as to whether the risk of pervasive monitoring is worth the trade-offs. And this exercise may prove challenging, as it's likely that interests will be divergent and sometimes in direct conflict. The whole community will have to step up and accept shared and collective responsibility for these issues. I mean, this is a long-term problem space. As we deploy mitigations, new attack vectors will be discovered. So with these thoughts, what I'd like to do now, with Shernan's permission, is to turn it over to you. I'd really like to hear from you your views on pervasive surveillance in the region.
Yep. Hello.
Sorry, before I give you the opportunity to ask questions, I just would like to ask Christine to share with us ISOC's position with respect to pervasive surveillance. We have heard this morning with respect to Rahul highlighting, for example, Internet Society's position with respect to new global initiatives going on. So I would like, in order for us to get a better understanding, maybe you can just highlight what is our Internet Society's official position in this regard, and after that I think we can be discussing this. Thank you.
Thank you, Sherman. Well, the Internet Society is very concerned about pervasive monitoring or pervasive surveillance and the impact that that has on the Internet and Internet users. This is a solution that needs to be solved with everyone. It needs strong principles through the international community, and we're very pleased to see strong statements coming out of the UN General Assembly and other important international and regional and local influential policy and legal bodies. It's important to have these statements clarifying that, first of all, collection in of itself can be a violation of privacy. So arguing that it's okay, we're only collecting data and we're only going to use a little bit, is not an excuse. It's also very important that the international community is starting to recognise that metadata can have a very adverse effect on privacy as well. These are very important issues that need to be addressed by everyone. They're not solely policy and legal solutions. As I mentioned, the Internet technical community is taking this very seriously and is working very hard to strengthen the Internet against pervasive surveillance. I can't speak for the business community, but I imagine they also are undertaking steps to address this issue. We, as a multi-stakeholder community, need to stand together, address these issues, debate what is appropriate and what is not appropriate, and deal with these together.
Okay, thank you very much. Muchas gracias, Christine. Tenemos algunas preguntas antes. Nico, and after that, Peter as well.
Thank you. Actually, it's like a suggestion. I would say, sorry, English is not my native tongue, so I apologize for my terrible accent and vocabulary. I remember about 5 years ago, there was this pre-IGF meeting in Rio de Janeiro. I think it was in 2009 or 2010. I don't remember very well. I participated, and there was this technical workshop. I remember the name of the engineer. I think it was Caroso or something like that. He was from Uruguay. I don't know if anybody here was there at that time. Exactly, Eduardo Caroso. Very good presentation. I remember that time I suggested teaching people how to use open source code in order to be able to access the source code, in order to be able to audit the source code, right? And at that time they told me, no, but we use Macintosh, we use, not everybody uses Windows, and so on and so forth. Any engineer here would know that using Windows, which is unfortunately used by 90% of the people around the world, is like for any technical engineer, for any technical person, right? It's like 300% easier to spread malware, viruses, trojans, and everything, right? So I think a good idea would be to organize through Internet Society, or I don't know how, maybe through the chapters, national chapters or whatever, workshops on teaching how to use properly open source software. Thank you.
Maybe we can just comment on that. Cristiano Flarti. Just una sugerencia, just a question. I know, and maybe you can just give us some suggestion here. Within the IATF, there are some discussions going on with respect to open source community, isn't it like that? So maybe you can give some comments what you think could be done.
thought you were asking me because I raised my hand, but okay. Yes, there's, I would not say yet, it's just discussions on the importance of engaging the open source community or open source developers in the process itself, because there's a need to include the IETF standards on the code that it's deployed broadly on the computers. And the open source is the fastest, I would say, track in order to get that code implemented. But and as Christine mentioned, there is also a big discussions around the massive surveillance and the data protections and things like that. But those discussions are not related at all. They are like two different groups interested on different topics. So the interest on the open source community is just trying to engage them. That's not related at all with security.
Thank you, Shannon. In light of your question, let me agree with you that it's very important that all of this code be audited, particularly in light of the revelations that certain cryptographic elements may have been compromised. One thing you might like to look at is a new project called the Cryptech project. It's cryptech.is, and basically it's a new project to do open hardware cryptographic engine, a sort of a modular approach. I think you'd find it very interesting. And this is a project that the Internet Society is supporting to help make available strong cryptographic hardware developed in an open way to deal with these issues.
Other questions? Yeah, Peter, sorry.
Alô? Agora, ok, tá bom. Christine, I must say I can speak English. Really, when you talked about, storing for the future and, dealing with future super computers to crack anything we have today, I was really kind of quivering in my boots. I guess I'll probably be dead by the time they get all of that, but our grandchildren and children will have to live with this. Now, frankly, I have to say, what is to be done? An old question posed by a gentleman in Russia. Because you've shown all the privacy concerns, but there are the security system concerns with our banking data, with enterprises like Google, Facebook, Twitter, and so forth would shrivel because their source of financing would dry up. The Great Wall in China is very active. Snowden may be in Russia, but Russia's probably about as bad or worse than the United States at invading computers and pervasive surveillance. So, in George Orwell, back in 1984, I kind of set the theme here. So, we have on one hand, we have balkanization of the Internet proceeding, which runs against all the original principles and ideals of the Internet. So, frankly, I watched the debate here in Brazil because the Marcos Civil debated these issues, and then the security community aquí was also, it's a balance, right? So setting the balance when you don't even know what the technology is today, much less what it's going to be tomorrow, is a very difficult technical problem. I'm hoping that Internet Engineering Task Force will come up with some help, but it's easy to state the issues. It's much harder when we have cyber criminals, private or mafia-like operating. We have national states operating. We have non-state actors from Islamic Jihad to Islamic State or whatever also in the game. So there are legitimate security concerns, and there are obviously the privacy concerns, and then there are the economic concerns of the parties. So, I mean, where does ISOC come out on this? Are we going to depend on IETF to solve all our problems, or because the balkanization is not, a very encouraging thought either.
Thank you. That's a very dark picture. And first of all, let me highlight one of the things that you said, that this is not just one country involved in pervasive surveillance, as far as we know. One of the other things you highlighted, I was asked to talk about pervasive surveillance, so the ever-present surveillance. And I think if you probably heard me say, I mean, there may be circumstances where the public interest is higher that may warrant appropriate targeted surveillance. That's not for me to decide. I don't think it's for the Internet Society to decide what is appropriate. What this Internet Society can do is help ensure that all voices get heard on these very difficult issues. We really need to think in the legal space, what does necessary mean? What does proportionate really mean? When we talk about surveillance online, when we talk about national security issues, we need to ask the question, is there a case ever where pervasive surveillance is warranted? And these are tough questions that people perhaps are reluctant to answer, but we need to think, these are the tough questions we need to ask. I think the work that the Internet technical community is doing is very important as well, because I don't think we can rely solely on policy or law. We need to approach this problem in all sectors of the community. It is a challenge technically to improve the security and resilience of the Internet against those that wish to get access to the data and the metadata. It's always a sort of an arms race in that sense. But you've raised some very important issues, and I really think we need to consider them.
Thank you, Christine. I would like to take 2 more questions because I know it's Friday and we have another session. And we are here in Brazil, so we need to enjoy the samba as well. So I would like to, Luis. Yes, you had a question.
Yes, I will just make a quick comment. You were asking about what was going on in our countries, and I would like to share you the Mexican experience in a very short way. We have a very strong data protection law, which means that every time you tell your name to someone behind a computer screen, they have to read you a disclaimer that takes 2 minutes at least with that. That goes into your name, and your data goes into a database, and then it's supposed, allegedly, to be protected by the law. However, if there is no enforcement or any punishment whenever there's misuse of your data, so it happens nothing. You only lose time because nobody's taking care of what happens if you misuse the data. So that's one thing, and the other thing is a recent privacy breach of data has been happening not in the government, rather than in users, and mainly political users. Yes, and they are coming from mobile data. Yes, they're accessing the data stored in the caches, in the cache at the mobile tower radio stations. They go there and they get audio, video, data, photographs, whatever they need, and they don't even go into databases. They just go from there and then just make disclosing information from conversations. So essentially, that's the Mexican experience on privacy breaching.
Thank you for sharing that experience with us, and you also reminded me of something that's probably worth saying, that there are many countries that do have data protection laws, and then there's the issue that Luis mentioned, whether or not they're enforced. But the other point to keep in mind is that in many countries, if you look at the law, often there are exemptions or limited application when it comes to national security or intelligence agencies.
I would like to take the last question for today. Over here.
Congratulations for your presentation. Thank you for sharing your point of views. I would like to make some highlights. I work with technology and security was one of the last of my credentials that I added to my curriculum. And there are some reports. I think you have pinpoint interesting discussion here, because pervasive surveillance. Which one we can avoid? Which one we can counterbalance? Let's say like that. The targeted one would be a good candidate for that. Because there are some things that you cannot go against. You cannot stop an entity like the U.S. government. I would say not even the people from U.S. would stop the government, their own government. If they want to do something, they will. They have the resources and technology. The way the technology moves is, I would say, resistance is useless. If you want to be anonymous, you probably would leave your life, your civilized life. You will live outside of our cities. Everything walks to that. So I would say that I will share some point of view, technical point of views. Working with government, you know certain facts that really makes you wonder. For instance, in the attack of the NATO forces to Libya, there are reports that all the computers from the Libya country were shut down remotely just before the aircraft reached the territory. So everything shut down. How could they shut down remotely everything? They have that power. They have that kind of visibility. One hacker last year reported that he went to U.S. He has a Mac, and he got infected by a virus. And he was not connected to any network. After that he realized that that virus came in his computer through his microphone, using a bug that probably was inserted there with that purpose. So if you go to US or you go to China, go back and format your computer, because you're gonna live with a virus, and you're probably all your computers are already infected. And this is the life as we are living now. So the targeted one that you point is probably the one that we should keep a good view on it, because targeted can be counterbalanced. If you live in a society where you have a good reputation, I think all of that actually reflects our society as it is now. So it is important to learn living in a community. We don't know yet, I believe, as individuals, live in a community, in a global community. Living in a global community, having a good reputation, being known as a good citizen can make that difference if you are obviously the victim of a targeted surveillance. There are many cases like that. In U.S., they made a movie, The Informant. There was a guy that was against companies of the tobacco industry, and his life was destroyed. But what saved him? Of course, he had some luck. He had a guy from the media that helped him, and but his reputation, I believe, he was a professor, he was a teacher, so that guy was a good citizen. He fought a lot, and he could prove his innocence. I think this shows us that we must learn how to live in a community. That's probably the only possible way I can see.
Thank you for sharing those views with us. I'm not quite sure what to say after that, except to say, and I haven't said so much about civil society as yet because I was expecting everyone here to say it for me. But it's important as individuals and as members of civil society groups that we express views, that we say what is acceptable, what is not acceptable, because if people remain silent, nothing will happen.
I would like to give Christine just 15 seconds to give your final remarks, and then we'll close this session.
Thank you very much, Sherman. I think I've said more than enough, so let me take my 15 minutes to say seconds, to say thank you to everybody. Thank you for joining me in this conversation, and I hope that we'll have more opportunities to discuss these issues later. Thank you.